This is 91.3 FM, WCW in Worcester, Massachusetts, the Dr. Chris Radio of Horror program. Tonight on Radio of Horror, recording over Skype, calling to me from New Hampshire is author Scott Baker, author of Vampirenomicon, the Vampire Hunters trilogy, as well as several other books in the horror genre that he has written. Thank you for calling into the show with us, Scott.
Well, thank you for having me.
Scott, for people not familiar with your work, and as you mentioned that you recently moved to New Hampshire, how long have you been writing, and where did you get your start in writing as an author?
I have been writing since early 2000. About 2004, I started writing horror. And then around 2009, I got my first novel published, The Vampire Hunters, which is the first book in a trilogy. And the whole trilogy, The Vampire Hunters, Vampirenomicon, and the final book, Dominion, is sort of my take on terrorism. When I was in Virginia, I worked for the Central Intelligence Agency for 23 years, and I did some work on terrorism. And the one thing about the terrorism was I saw the similarities with vampires. It's one of those things, they're heartless, they don't care who their victims are, and it was one of those incidents that if you took down one terrorist, if you took down one vampire, 2 or 3 more took their place. And the main characters in the trilogy were Drake Matthews, the gung-ho, we're going to fight this war to the end type of person, who was the leader of the group. Allison Monroe, who was his partner, who was fighting the good fight, but realized at some point she's going to want to go and live her own life. And then there was the kid Jim, who was sort of drafted into this war and didn't want to be there to begin with.
Backing up just a quick second, so you said you worked for the CIA for 23 years?
Yes.
What was your position with the CIA, or is that classified?
No, it isn't. I was an open officer for those 23 years. I spent the last 10 years as they call it a collection management officer.
Okay.
What I did was talk to assets, work with case officers, making sure that what the assets were giving us accurate information, that they were legitimate, that they either weren't double agents or con artists trying to screw us out of some money. And then I would file the intelligence reports.
Were you based entirely in the where they work at the Pentagon, right?
I was based in Langley, Virginia, at CIA headquarters. Earlier in my career, I did, when I wasn't doing that, I was doing another job. I spent 3 years at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, and then 3 years in Seoul, South Korea.
Wow. You must have some thoughts and opinions about everything that's happening over in Korea right now, but that is a whole entirely different type of show and podcast that I do not cover. But what made you want to write about, this type of horror and not stories about like the CIA or case files that you worked on that have become declassified that you could like write about and such, or transcribe in a way to protect, like I read books by former CIA people that, have changed the facts to, protect people and so on and so forth. But the main plot is still based on a real CIA case.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because originally I was writing techno thrillers. And I had written a really good techno thriller about North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons and blackmailing the United States with them. And I had an agent. The agent had it with a big-name publisher, and then 9/11 hit. And the market dried up for techno thrillers overnight. I couldn't sell anything like that. So I spent a couple of years doing overseas work for the agency on terrorism. And when I came back, I was thinking, well, what do I want to do? And I've always loved horror movies. I've loved reading horror. I've been a monster kid since, as far back as I can remember. So I figured, well, let me try my hand at horror. That never goes out of style.
Now, and of course, being retired, you have all the time in the world to write without having to worry about, I got to go to a 9-to-5 job or 8 to 12, and then, I'm too tired to come home and write. I got to put it off till the weekend. You can spend every day for the rest of your life writing now that you're retired.
Mm-hmm. And that is like a dream come true.
Rotter Apocalypse, the artwork for that series, which is on Kindle, who does the artwork for it?
For which series?
Rotter Apocalypse?
The artwork on that, one second, let me make sure I get the name correct. The artwork is done by Zach McCain. He did the artwork for Rotter World, and when I told him what I was looking for, I mean, the cover was even better than I could imagine. So when I self-published Rotter Nation and Rotter Apocalypse, I reached out to Zach, and Zach was more than willing to do the covers for those two books since he enjoyed doing the cover for the first one.
Which do you find easier to write, a story about zombies or a story about vampires?
When I started writing the vampire stories, there were very few. My vampires are completely badass. They don't glitter and date teenage girls. They don't sit around in puffy shirts, thinking, oh God, I bit someone in the neck. Yeah, I like my vampires like Christopher Lee. He was my favorite Dracula. And at the time, there were very few badass vampire books. The Strain hadn't come out yet. I don't think Wellington's 99 Bullet, 99 Coffin series had come out yet. So I decided, let me write the vampire story I want. And it's about several masters in Washington, D.C. And the masters, they look human. They can transform into monsterific vampires if they want. And they command these legions of what we call in the book snuffies. The ugly, bat-looking vampires that are mindless killing machines that do the bidding of the masters. And the whole series is how the vampire hunters, with a secret benefactor, fight the vampire nests in D.C. And with the third book, I actually have like a vampire apocalypse. There's a battle between good and evil, and only one side wins.
Yeah, it seems like definitely in the last, it goes without saying, in the last 7 years, in the last 17 years, vampires and zombies need to die down for a while. Vampires, I think, have finally been given a breather. Zombies, obviously, are still very prevalent in the spotlight, with The Walking Dead being the #1 show on cable. But vampires, we are definitely in a relaxed mode with those, because The Strain was the last vampire show. There's still the originals, but they're not every 5 minutes in our face. And honestly, the amount of vampire movies in theaters, I can barely remember.
I mean, the only like one or two that really stand out for me is like 30 Days of Night, Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was half vampire, half, Victorian romance. But you don't get those same vampire movies like you do, like you said, with all the zombie movies. It's not in your face all the time.
When I think of vampires and Nazis, I'm reminded of the Blood Rain video games. Did yours came before that? If yours came out in 2000, right?
Oh, I love Blood Rain. Yes.
The video game,
yeah.
Not the shitty movies by Uwe Boll. The video game came out, I think, in like 2001 or 2002.
It might have been. It was a long time ago, yeah.
And over in The Strain, they also had like Nazis and vampires together as well.
Yes, Icorst, which I don't remember if he was in the book, but they do that a lot, I've noticed lately. They're welding it. I'm even actually working on a future series because I'm a historian. I was trained as a historian, and my specialty was Soviet history and modern German history, particularly World War II. And a series that I'm going to be coming forth with in a few years is called OSS, Office of Supernatural Services. It's going to be the U.S. intelligence services battling Nazi occultism during World War II.
Aren't you worried that sounds a little bit too close to like the BRPD, which is the organization that Hellboy works for?
It sounds a little bit, but I'm sort of, what I'm going to do, it's going to be an offshoot of the intelligence community. And I'm not really having them fighting demons so much. There's a lot of mysteries involving World War II, things that nobody's ever been able to answer that I'm trying to pull together.
Okay. There was a comic book series by IDW in the early 2000s which crossed the CIA with vampires. It was Vampires Covert Ops, and they
I have not seen that. I'll have to hunt that down.
yeah, it ran for like a couple of miniseries, and then they I think it was like one miniseries and a one shot. They lay dormant for a little while, and then IDW had an idea to cross over Area 51, which was a book they did about a little gray alien who smokes, with the Covert Ops, and they find out about a interdimensional. They did two crossovers, I think, with them, if I remember correctly. The first one was called Infestation, in which a zombie plague breached the interdimensional gateway and went into the IDW multiverse. And the VCO, Vampire Covert Operatives, had to transverse to the universe that the Transformers, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Star Trek, and Adventures of Dungeons and Dragons existed in.
That sounds interesting.
Yes, so you had you had the Turtles fighting zombies, you had Kirk and Spock and McCoy fighting zombies, you had a zombie virus that mutated to the point it could infect, non-organic life, hence the Transformers, which actually affected their storyline going forward with one of their characters becoming a zombie and having to be taken to what's called the Dead Universe, which was a ongoing plotline in those comics for a long time. Again, Adventures of Dungeons and Dragons, that was the only one I didn't read, which I thought was pretty fascinating. And the Covert Ops, vampire group, again, went around the dimension trying to stop, the virus from spreading or like recapture it in a way to not affect the multiverse of IDW.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always impressed when somebody can come up with a new twist on an old theme and breathe new life into it.
You also have several short stories and some short story anthologies too.
Yes, I do. I've got two of them. One of them, Cruise of the Living Dead, is all zombie-related stories I've done over the years. It goes from Cruise of the Living Dead is the keynote short story. It's a zombie outbreak aboard a cruise ship. At the time, I had not seen anything like that, and I always thought that would be the place. That would be one of the scariest places to have a zombie outbreak. It also includes The Hunger, which is cannibalism during a zombie apocalypse. Rednecks Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, which was my first zombie story. That came about during a night of drinking with my best friend and watching George Romero movies. And we always wondered what would happen, because everybody in the movies is like, oh, shoot them in the head. Well, what would happen if shooting them in the head didn't work? And then in that anthology, I think those are the three major stories. And there's a few other short ones. Incident on Ironstone Lane is my non-zombie related horror anthology. And that's just some sick and twisted musings I've done.
The short story you mentioned, the Cruise of the Dead, I don't think that's been made into a movie yet, so maybe someone will snatch that up and turn it into a Sci-Fi Channel movie of the week.
Oh, I'm hoping. I would love to have that.
Just because the name kind of implies, very, very cheesy kind of movie title. But they've done so many of those, like, of the dead, this, that, and the other thing. There's still more to do. Just give it time for the zombie genre to slow down and then maybe, bring it back. Resurrect it, if you will.
I figure if Sci-Fi Channel is going to pick up anything, they're going to pick up Nazi ghouls from space. That just sounds like something that's right up their alley.
There is a video game series I play a lot, which combines horror and Nazis, which has been very popular. It's been around since predating Doom, the Wolfenstein video games.
I love Wolfenstein, yes.
And I remember reading up on Wolfenstein, somebody from who worked on Wolfenstein's like stories and stuff, or one of the developers actually used to have a government job. He was, or he was ex-military. I forget which.
I mean, Nazis make great villains because nobody cares if you shoot Nazis.
Well, not. I mean, you got to give them their nowadays you have to give them their equal rights and allow them to march in the streets with their tiki torches and white golf shirts. Or am I thinking of a whole other group altogether? No, I'm not actually.
I mean, it was funny because the whole thing about the novella I wrote, Nazi Ghouls from Space, came about at a dinner table conversation. My wife and I were talking about one of our favorite movies, Red Snow.
Yes, that and its sequel are both excellent films.
The sequel is fantastic. And I jokingly said to my wife, there's nothing cooler than Nazi zombies. And my daughter, who was 14 at the time, goes, yes, Dad, Nazi zombies from space. So by the end of the night, I had the whole thing plotted out and started writing it.
Yeah, and they do. There's a. They're not zombies, but there's a Nazis in space series. Oh god.
Iron Sky.
Iron Sky, yes. Which is fantastic because our main character is a black guy disguised as a white guy.
Yes.
And he's from I think the present day, 2016 or 2015, and he's dealing with Nazis that are still living like they're in the 1940s.
Yep, like they're living on the moon, and they got the giant SWAT sticker base on the dark side. And then I'm dying to see the sequel to it when she travels to Middle Earth and Adolf Hitler is a reptilian riding a T-Rex named Blondie.
Yeah, or it's I think it's the center of the Earth, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Where can people go to find your book, Scott? And do you plan on going to any conventions to start selling your books?
I am going to be going to conventions. I didn't move up here until the summer. And by the time I got here, all of the local conventions were already sold out for vendors. So I'm going to start looking around. I've been in contact with a lot of the conventions for 2018. And I'm going to start attending the conventions. I'm going to bring my books. I write a young adult post-apocalypse series under a different name, the name Josh Matthews, which I've been concentrating on the past year or two. And I'm just going to be hitting the convention circuit in New England and starting to get my name out there, making new fans up in this area. Hopefully do more interviews and just, get out there and be, get my name known.
Cool. Where can people contact? In all your social media sites are on your website as well?
Yes, the best place is you can find me on Facebook, Scott M. Baker, author on Facebook. That's my writer's page. That's where I list everything. I post a whole bunch of stuff. I post writing related, interesting articles about zombies and vampires, and then if I've got any new books coming out or any conventions, that's where I post them. Or you can look at me, vampire_hunters on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, again, Scott, thank you for coming on the show and talking with us a little bit about your collection of books that you've written and a little bit of your history with the CIA as well.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to get out there and, start to get to know the fans up here. I was born and raised in Boston. I've been away from New England for 30 years, and it's good to be back. Cool. I was one of the few people that enjoyed the first snowstorm up here a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, yeah, that kind of overpassed us, so thank God we missed it, because I'm not ready to deal with that shit just yet.